Hello everybody, welcome to week 4 of the course. Hope everybody's doing well, semester's going well. We're sort of clipping along. So one announcement before we get started, talking about the material, was this notion of sort of making 2 dates for the discussion. Originally I had it set where I wanted you to respond. I'll post the discussion question on Wednesday, and I wanted you guys to respond to both myself and a classmate by Saturday night. The problem with that was that some people were waiting, late until Saturday to post their first post, which made it challenging for people to post their post and respond to somebody else's post. They didn't want to be doing it late Saturday night. So what I've done is this. So in order to get full participation credit, I want you to at least respond to my question by Saturday at midnight. And then I want you guys to have responded to one of your classmates by Monday morning at 10 a.m. So that'll give you time, if you post your, post early, you don't have to wait until Saturday night to do it. You can check it on, Sunday night, or even Monday morning and reply to somebody at that point. The reason that I do it that way, I don't know if I explained it or not, is, in an online class we have a mix of traditional and non-traditional students. Some people work, a full-time job during the week, and they do their work on the weekend, so that's why I wanted to make, that discussion due on Saturday. But I understand it's challenging when you have that mix of traditional and non-traditional students, so I'm trying to sort of accommodate both people. So hopefully this will work. If you guys are having trouble with that, let me know. We'll see if we can do something to make it work. But I think this should solve the problem. Okay, so last week we looked at sort of the foundations, right? We're going to continue to do that this week, but it certainly merits revisiting, right? Because it is the foundational document of our country, right? And there's some debate on this about whether the Constitution is the foundational document or the Declaration of Independence. A lot of political theorists will argue that the Declaration of Independence is the political theory that supports the United States, and the Constitution was trying to implement the theory that was laid out in the Declaration of Independence. So anyway, it's worth revisiting. So I had you guys look at that. I had you watch the John Adams Live Free or Die, where it sort of gives you a sense. You see the Boston Massacre, and you see the Boston Tea Party start to happen, and you see Adams, who is a very moral man and a sort of a loyal subject of England, because he is a legal, he's a law-abiding person. But you see him make the transition, based on moral grounds, right, from being a subject of Britain to being an American, right? So you see that it's not his cultural loyalties that change, right? It's his legal, his concept of justice tied to the laws was what makes him make the switch from being a subject of England to being an American patriot, right? So it's the principle behind it is the reason that he makes the shift. It's not because his cousin Sam Adams, who just wanted to be, an American son of liberty, right? But he was more interested in being an American than a son of liberty. It was Adams, John Adams, who liberty actually mattered to. So, and he pretty clearly demonstrated that in the speech that the Liberty Will Reign speech that he talks about at the end. And then the last thing I had you guys look at was Douglas's "What is the 4th of July to the slave?" Right. So the Declaration of Independence, and if you guys have listened to the recording for this particular week, you'll know that the guy points out that it's a legal argument, right? Jefferson and the people who wrote it were making a legal argument, petitioning the King of England, right? Saying that we have this list of 27 grievances that we've come up with, right? And we consider ourselves to be citizens, right? And free subjects. And you have essentially not been living up to the social contract. You haven't been living up to the bargain. So it's a legal argument and a moral argument, right? He starts with the moral argument by saying those most, famous words in American political theory, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, right? Endowed by the laws of nature and by the laws of the God of the laws of nature, right? The Creator. So that's the moral part, and that's, that is the foundations of political liberalism. Is this, and it was, something that it didn't just come out of Jefferson. I mean, Jefferson and the founders were, products of their time, right? They lived during the Enlightenment. When, the guy who was talking about federalism today, as I was listening to this recording again, was talking about, he kept referring to Newtonian mechanics, right? And the people who were the philosophers, the scientists who were living during that time believed that the laws of nature, existed in harmony, right? And it was like a machine, right? And these laws were eternal and immutable, right? So it was interesting to see sort of the scientific, the scientific consistency of the political principles and the more sort of natural science. Or the laws of politics. The founders and the Enlightenment thinkers thought that the laws of politics were just as constant as the law of gravity. This wasn't a cultural moment for them where they thought that the truth that all men are created equal, well, that's true in 1776, but it's not true in 2015, right? So to these guys, these were scientific laws that could be taken as truths, right? So that's the mindset they were coming from. And so obviously Newton laid out, his, laws of gravity and all of the sort of physical workings of the universe. And John Locke came along. And John Locke wrote his second treatise on government. And in that is when he laid out what are considered to be the natural laws for human beings and human nature. And Locke lays out, essentially the philosophy of liberalism that Jefferson and the founders laid out in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Because Locke said, if I'm sure you guys are familiar with this, Locke said in the second treatise that all men are entitled to life, liberty, and property. However, this was changed to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in the Declaration of Independence, right? So, and this pursuit of happiness thing is interesting because in a liberal society where you are free to pursue whatever you want, the founders realized that there were inevitably going to be differences about, what makes somebody happy, right? I mean, and what we're really talking about when we're talking about pursuit of happiness is we're talking about liberty of conscience. Some people are Jewish, some people are Christian, some people are atheists, right? What is your conception of the good life? Is essentially what we're talking about. So not only do you have the right to your life, right? You have the right to not be killed, right? So safety, liberty to pursue things, pursue your rights as long as you're not imposing upon somebody else's rights, and the pursuit of happiness. You have the freedom to pursue whatever you think it is that leads to the good life, whatever the good life is for you. Once again, as long as that conception does not impose upon other people. If your conception of the good life is, your pursuit of happiness is to go out and murder people, right, then we draw the line there, right, because that's something that's an important theme in this course. And when you're talking about liberties and rights, you have to remember that there are corresponding duties that go along with these rights, right? So I have the right to life, right not to be killed. That means that I have a corresponding duty not to kill other people, right? So, but that doesn't mean that, so even though people have these rights and these duties, the people can actually abdicate their rights, right? So here's an example. Let's say that I have the right to life, right, and somebody else has the right to life, and I go into your house with a gun with the means and the intent to kill you. Now, even though I have the right to life, by going in and threatening your life, I have sort of abdicated my duty. Therefore, when I abdicate my duty to not kill you, I lose my right to life. And you have a legal, you have the legal right to kill me, right, in self-defense, or stand your ground, or whatever you want to call it. So there's a complex interplay that happens between rights and duties, and that's what's going on in the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson says, look, we have these rights, and as our sovereign in England, you have a duty to respect these rights, and you have not, right? And here's 27 reasons why you have not respected our rights. Therefore, we have the right to dissolve our political bonds with you. So it's a legal argument, right? And it's a civilized, civilized way to proceed. Because they say, we've tried time and again, we've petitioned the crown to make these changes, and all we've gotten is more abuse. So enough is enough, and we are within our legal means, our legal and our moral right to start a revolution, right? And that's, once again, that's something that comes out of Locke. Locke says at the end of the second treatise, he says, if these rights are not respected, not only do you have the right to revolution, you have a duty to carry out a political revolution. So that's what's, there's a lot more going on than that, but essentially speaking, that's what's going on, right? And it's the same notion that that Adams was talking about in his "Liberty Will Reign" speech. The key phrase, "We hold these truths to be self-evident," in the Declaration, Adams says the self-evident truth is that the meanest and the lowest among us have the exact same rights to life and liberty that the nobles have. It's not granted by kings. It's something that's inherent, as he said, something that we have by virtue of being human beings, right? So that is liberty, as he says, and liberty will reign in America. Whether it's reigning or not is a question, right? And that's where Frederick Douglass came into play. And he said, sure, liberty reigns if you're white, you're a landowner, right? So these liberties that you speak of don't apply to, a lot of people, right, in the country, and specifically and grossly the issue of slavery, right? So it's not just that they don't have the liberties, it's that slavery is the exact opposite of liberty, right? So how can you possibly, on one hand, say we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and then have slaves, right? And then he goes through all these things. He's like, well, can you say, maybe you're trying to say that slaves aren't men, but, you have certain, conditions in your Constitution that say that slaves are men, right? So it can't be that you're saying that all men are created equal, but slaves aren't men, right? So where do you have left to hide? Where's your refuge on this? And that's when he brings in that statement about, scour the earth, scour South America, right? And you won't find a greater example of hypocrisy anywhere in the world than the United States, right? But to Douglas's credit, the thing that he doesn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? He doesn't say, okay, yeah, so you guys are big hypocrites, so this whole system of government sucks. No, he says that the ideal is amazing, right? And it's something that we should strive to live up to. But we're hypocrites because we're not living up to it, right? And not only are we not living up to it, but we're essentially spitting in the face of it through slavery, right? So that's when I asked you guys, how can you reconcile these two ideas? This idea of liberty as a natural scientific law that's inherent in man, and the notion of slavery happening in the United States. And in short, the answer is that you can't reconcile it, right? At least not theoretically. There are some, political reasons why it happened, right? But you can't. They're contradictory, right? The notion of slavery and the notion of liberty that's talked about in the Declaration of Independence, and that Douglass talks about in What is the 4th of July to the Slave, right? So those philosophically, those notions are contradictory. But there are some things that you can say, right? So one thing you can say is that political pragmatism, right? When the Constitution was trying to be forged, so that's another step, right? So, and we're going to look at that step this week, right? the Constitution was trying to be the implementation, or some would say, trying to be the implementation of the ideals laid out in the Declaration of Independence. Right? So, but in order to get that passed, in order to even set up a government based on those principles laid out in the Declaration of Independence, because the American government under the Articles of Confederation was a huge failure, you had to make political compromises. Right? And in order for the Constitution to be ratified, 9 of the 13 states had to ratify it. And, a big majority of those, or a good number of those, were slave states. So even to get the plane off the ground, right, they sort of just took the issue of slavery. They decided not to address it in the Constitution, right? But they put in a mechanism for amending the Constitution. Hopefully, they were saying that Jefferson said, Adams said, we leave it to the next generation to try to solve this terrible evil, right? Because we've got the ball in play. Now, given the ideals that we've set out in the Declaration of Independence, given the mechanism that we've put into place with the Constitution and amending the Constitution, can we right the ship, right? So political pragmatism is a big issue when trying to sort of get your head around how this could be the case, right? Because if slavery had been off the table, right, and they're saying we can't form a strong government if there are going to be slave states, then we wouldn't be here right now. Another thing to consider too is that even when Douglass was making that speech, he was exercising a very strong version of freedom of speech, right? I mean, he went to a 4th of July. He was invited to a 4th of July celebration in a room full of incredible dignitaries and people of incredible power, and he said, "You're hypocrites," right? I mean, that for one thing, it takes a lot of guts, but another thing is that he actually had the right, the freedom to get up and do that, right? And that was one of the things that came out of the Bill of Rights and the Constitution and the Declaration, which if slavery had been an issue, that he may not have even had that right, right? I mean, would things have been better for Douglass if there had been no American government? The answer is probably no, right? So it's reconciling the theoretical contradiction with the practical realities, right? And in this class, we're more concerned with the theoretical stuff, but we have to keep an eye on the practical realities that shaped these theories. Okay, so I wanted to point out a few things that I saw in the discussion. I thought the discussion was very good, and you guys are making some really good points, trying to sort of, reconcile these seemingly irreconcilable issues. One person made an observation which I thought was really good during the John Adams scene, during the John Adams episode. We see the hypocrisy right there, right? Because during the sort of the Boston Tea Party scene where the guy gets tarred and feathered, Adams is absolutely repulsed by what's happening, and rightly so. But at the same time, there are slaves, African slaves, who are on the docks in chains, right? And there's no repulsion there to that. But yet, when this guy's tarred and feathered, there's the repulsion. So clearly some sort of moral contradiction happening in that particular scene. And then I ask you guys the question of, well, where do we currently sit, right? We know we were screwed up with slavery, right? And that contradiction almost sunk us, right? And the United States almost ceased to exist because of that contradiction, right? But then Abraham Lincoln came along, and we fought for the Union, right? And we fought for these principles. So, and we're going to talk, more about Lincoln down the road, but we almost didn't make it for that very reason. And then, people were bringing up this notion of what about what's happening internationally, right? How do we reconcile? We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men, not all Americans, right, are created equal, when we're torturing, prisoners. We're holding people without a trial, right? So once again, we're getting into these questions of, theory versus practical realities, right? And it's also a question that you have to remember, and this is not true in all cases, and I'm not trying to defend what we have done and what we're doing, but it's this notion of rights and duties, right? Do you abdicate your right, your right to, I don't know, I don't want to say being tortured, right? Because we're getting into sort of cruel and unusual punishment, but do you abdicate your right to not be tortured when you're plotting a terrorist activity or planning to carry out a terrorist activity against, innocent people, right? Do you abdicate that right? I think that's a question that's on the table, and that's a question that the U.S. government, for expediency, and a lot of other governments around the world have said yes, you do, right? So that's definitely something to keep in mind. And are we being morally superior? No, we're not, right? Certainly, you look at the list of things that came out in the torture report, and it's repulsive. But we are, and we got ourselves into a lot of this mess, right? But we're engaging in these battles against terrorists, right? And we see the horrors that are happening around the world now. I mean, we don't live in the world where liberty might reign, arguably in America, but it certainly doesn't reign around the world. You look at what's going on in Nigeria with Boko Haram, things like that. There's some terrible things happening, right? So that's the world we live in, and we may be in that situation that the founders were in the beginning, where look, you just have to, in order to, I hate to say it, right, in order to make an omelet, you might have to break a few eggs, right, and you might have to make some political compromises and expediencies to try to make things better, right, and that's, morally speaking, that's a tough pill to swallow, right? Does the end justify the means, right? And it's one thing to be doing these things to people who have not given up their rights, by infringing upon other people's rights. Is it justifiable to do these things if we know, and that's where the notion of a fair trial comes in, right, which we clearly have not given to many of these people, which may be the most grievous injustice of all. But if these people have perpetrated these crimes, have they given up their rights? And I think that's an interesting question. Anyway, that's going off on a tangent there. But internationally, no, we certainly don't hold others to the standards universally, and not even in the United States, right? I mean, we don't live up to our ideals. But we do have an ideal that we strive for, right? And I think that the institutions of the government try to get us there through the amendment process. And the guy was even talking about today, right, in the audio recording that when the Watergate scandal happened and Nixon was refusing to resign, the institutions of government all came together and did what they were supposed to do, right? So, are we perfect? No. Do we live up to the ideal? No, certainly not, right? But it's, hopefully we're making progress, right? And I think it would be hard to argue that we haven't made progress since the writings of Frederick Douglass, right? I mean, we have an African-American president right now. So, yeah, we have made social progress, and we have made progress towards this ideal, right? It's, as I said, people say that's American history, right? That's the American story, is trying to realize that ideal that's laid out in the Declaration of Independence. So we're still working on it. Anyway, I'll post the discussion question tomorrow, and hope you guys have a good week. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email. Don't forget, respond to my post by Saturday at midnight, and respond to your fellow classmates' post by Monday morning at 10 a.m. Have a good week.